Hey, good morning, everybody. Our previous video discussed the male reproductive system and the functions and some of the different anatomy for that. This video will discuss the female reproductive system. Three main functions for the female reproductive system. Number one is to produce the female reproductive cells called eggs. So the male reproductive system produces sperm. The female reproductive system is going to produce eggs. Female sex hormones are also produced during puberty, and estrogen levels will continue to rise during puberty or increase. Fertilization is the second main function. Basically, that means the creation of a new life. So the female reproductive system is basically where, as we talked about, a baby is created and begins to grow inside the female body. And then third is to give birth. So once that baby is created and the woman is then capable of giving birth, and the baby enters the new world. All right, so some important vocabulary for the female reproductive side. I'm going to post up the PowerPoint for you guys to and girls to look back at, but here are some important vocab terms. Number one is the ovaries. The ovaries are the two glands in the female's body that make the eggs. So the eggs, again, are the female reproductive cells. But ovaries also produce the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So kind of like similar to the male, where the testicles produce sperm, the ovaries are going to produce eggs. Something interesting to note, men produce millions and millions of sperm every time that they release sperm or ejaculation. Every time that they release semen, there's millions of sperm that are released. Women are born with all the eggs they're ever going to have in their lifetime. And it varies from female to female, but women do not have a new supply of eggs every day. When they're born at birth, they have all the eggs they're going to have for their entire lifetime. And then during puberty, those eggs start to mature in the ovaries. The fallopian tube. Fallopian tube is kind of like an avenue or a tube that leads from each ovary to the uterus. And you might ask, well, what's the uterus? Well, the uterus is the organ where the baby develops. So it's the organ where we basically call it the womb. All right, so it's where the baby grows and develops. The vagina is a tube-like structure that leads from the uterus to an outer opening. It's between the female's legs. Okay. Ovulation is the term that is referring to the releasing of an egg from inside the ovaries, and it's released into the uterus. And I'm going to show you that cycle of how I will discuss the menstrual cycle too, but I will show you how the egg is released and how it travels through the female's body. Typically, one egg is released each menstrual cycle. Sometimes two eggs are released. And so that gets us to the next one, menstruation. Menstruation, or the menstrual cycle, is the monthly breakdown and shedding of the uterine wall and the lining of the uterine wall that results in blood, tissues, and fluid leaving the female body. This is essentially another term is the woman's period. Okay, menarche is the first menstrual period. Menarche, and menopause is when menstruation stops forever. So that happens typically later on in a woman's life. Can happen sooner rather than later. But those two terms, it's beginning and the ending. Menarche and menopause are the two terms related to when the menstrual cycle begins and when it ends. Okay, so here's just an overview of the different terms that I just kind of briefly mentioned and I had on the previous slide. I will go through the journey of the egg in a moment, but I want to just review this. The menstrual cycle, also known as the menstruation or female's period, it's the monthly breakdown and shedding of the uterine lining, so the lining inside the uterus. Each month, basically, that lining kind of builds up and prepares for the female to have a potential pregnancy. If the woman does not become pregnant, as I will discuss in this PowerPoint, that lining sheds and it basically leaves the body. It's called the woman's period. Menstrual cycle first begins when the hormone levels increase and a girl reaches full puberty. So that's why we're discussing it, because we're discussing adolescence and puberty. When a woman or when a girl begins puberty and her levels are at high enough level as far as estrogen, then she will begin her period. Most cycles, menstrual cycles, last 28 days, but this will vary from female to female, and they're not always regular. They can be inconsistent. So if it's not normal and consistent, just understand that there's sometimes reasonings for that, and you can always consult your doctor to understand more about length of the cycle and why they are different. Okay, so on this slide, I'm going to discuss the journey of an egg. Okay, so the journey of an egg from where it begins in the female's body and to where it is potentially fertilized by a sperm. So to begin, we mentioned this term ovary. This is the ovary, the woman's ovary. So this is like we're looking at the woman from the front. This is the inside view of the woman's reproductive system, but it would be as if we're looking at her from the front. So this is the ovary. Again, once every menstrual cycle, the ovary will release an egg. So if you imagine that this red pointer is an egg, the egg is released from the ovary. It's going to travel up the fallopian tube, as we mentioned. So it's just kind of like an alleyway or a street. And it's going to eventually end up in the uterus. So let's just stop it right about there. So it ends up in the uterus. Now, if a woman chose to have sex, sorry, I'm going to put the cursor back up there. If a woman chose to have sex, sexual intercourse with a male, and unprotected sexual intercourse, which means they didn't use any type of condom or anything like that, and the sperm is released into the body, if that sperm and the egg meet up and become fertilized, okay, that fertilized egg will implant itself into this uterine wall, and it will begin to grow, and it will eventually develop into a baby, and the baby will be, through birth, childbirth, delivered when the woman has the baby at the hospital. Okay, so that's what happens if the sperm and the egg are fertilized. The baby begins to grow, and the baby is delivered 9 months later. Okay, if the egg never meets up with any sperm, so let's say that the woman does not have any sex, sperm and egg do not meet, so basically there's no fertilization that occurs. This unfertilized egg will leave the body when the woman has her period. So when the woman has her when she begins menstruation or has her period, this wall, this uterine wall, will shed, and the unfertilized unfertilized egg will leave the body with the woman's period. So it's basically flushed out of the body during the menstrual cycle. Okay, the brain pop video will go through that again in details, just like I did, but you can pause the video and it will show it and discuss it just like I did. So that's basically the cycle of how the woman's body releases an egg and the journey of the egg into the uterus, and if she becomes pregnant or not. It all depends on if she has sex. So the menstruation cycle timeline is a little bit different than what I just discussed as far as the journey of the egg. Your menstrual cycle actually begins, so days 1 through 5, that's when that uterine lining sheds. So each month, the woman's body prepares to have a potential pregnancy. That's why it's so important to understand these. As you're starting to go through puberty, men and women, again, you are capable of producing a life. You're capable of reproduction and producing a human life. Okay, so it's important to understand these steps. So days 1 through 5, that uterine wall is going to basically shed. The woman has her period. That's the beginning of the cycle. The woman has her period. After she has her period, a new egg is going to begin to mature inside that ovary, and that uterine wall is going to thicken back up. So it's going to thicken back up and to prepare for a potential pregnancy. So that's essentially what it does each month. the egg is released. So I mentioned this, you know, in the journey of the egg, but the egg is going to be released through a process called ovulation. Ovulation is when the egg is released. I talked about this with the cycle of the journey of the egg, but the egg is going to travel through the fallopian tubes, and then as it gets through the uterine wall, it's either going to be fertilized or it's not going to be fertilized. And if it's not fertilized, it leaves the body at the start of the next cycle when the woman has her period. If it is fertilized, it's going to implant itself in the uterus, down here in the uterus, and it's going to begin to grow into a baby, and typically around 9 months later, the baby is delivered. Okay, so I know that that is a lot of information, and I'm sure it's probably a little confusing. Hopefully the Brain Pop video will go through the details as well and help you understand it a little bit better. If you have questions, you can post comments in the Google Classroom. You can email me. You can ask a trusted adult at home if you feel comfortable with that. You can ask a medical provider, such as your doctor, if you have questions. It's normal to be confused about a lot of these things and topics. All right, so I'm going to stop the video now, and we are going to the next